Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, and today I'm joined by Tom Wigg from the Energy Systems Catapult. Following a master's in astrophysics, Tom has spent the last 10 years working in sustainability in the built environment. Firstly as a sustainability consultant, before becoming a senior advisor at the UK Green Building Council. He sat on the government's Solar Task Force, the LETI Steering Group, the BCD Steering Group, Neighbours Steering Group, and the Whole Life Carbon Network. I mean, what steering groups hasn't he been on? Tom now works as a senior advisor in the Net Zero Homes platform at Energy Systems Catapult, actively working with innovators, government, regulators, and industry bodies like Green Finance Institute and Citizen Advice to scale up the heat as a service market in the UK. Okay, let's get into the chat. Hey Tom, how you doing?
I'm very well, thanks, Kev.
Excellent, good, and carrying no injuries at all, which is excellent news, and no impediment to recording the podcast, which is great. So today we are going to talk about. Well, first I should say, welcome back, because you're a returning guest. You're in a different role now to the one you were in when we
slightly
spoke before.
Different hat on, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, slightly different hat, but still focused on the big picture stuff about decarbonisation, right? And that's kind of the thing. So yeah. Brilliant. Well, thanks for coming back. Obviously, it wasn't too bad an experience the first time round. So we're talking today about heat as a service. And if I'm really honest, until I reached out to you and said, do you want to come back on the podcast? And you said, I'd love to talk about heat as a service. I hadn't even really heard of it. So what would
that
be
makes
good?
Two of us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this could be a short conversation. Well, look, maybe let's start then with just what is heat as a service?
Yeah.
What's it all about?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. So I joined the Catapult last January, and before I joined, it was a term I hadn't really heard either. So It was a bit of a baptism of fire, but the Catapult gave me some space to do some research into heat as a service, which is actually an area that the Catapult has been doing quite a lot of research and work in for, I think, about the last 7 or 8 years, but picked up in the last 2 or 3, I'd say. But the concept, I think it means many things to many people, and no two are the same. And I think that's one of the big problems that we've got. One of the things to say is there's a bit of a false dichotomy. People see heat as a service as this single alternative to traditional domestic heat delivery, which it isn't. It's a spectrum of different, almost limitless different options of how you can deliver heat. I think the easiest way to describe it is by comparing it to traditional domestic heat delivery. So
a boiler and whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you got your gas boiler at home. And as a homeowner or as a resident, you have got the responsibility for arranging your energy supply contract. So who supplies your gas? You've then got to worry about programming your boiler and any of your room controllers, your TRVs on your radiators to give you the comfortable internal conditions that you want. You have also got to manage any of the logistics of getting a repair or a replacement if it breaks down. And ultimately, all of the risk sits with you. Now, I said that there was a spectrum of different options for heat as a service. I think it's easier than we compare to like the most ambitious utopian end of the heat as a service spectrum, which is the complete antithesis of that. So all of those risks and responsibilities that typically sit with you as a consumer transfer to a service provider. So you might have a service provider that designs, installs, and optimizes a heat pump for you. They then ensure that you're being provided the internal conditions that you want, so comfortable internal environment. And they are also responsible if it breaks down for maintaining and repairing it. And they, through that, align the incentives of the provider and the consumer to ensure that you're getting the outcome that you want without any of the complexity and the risk that's associated with those systems.
Well, that sounds nice.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that, what I should say is that in those arrangements, you'd probably end up just paying a fixed or a consistent monthly fee for that service, which means that you don't have to pay any of the upfront cost of the heating system, which is obviously a huge barrier to heat pump deployment at scale. And so what you would need to do is commit to a long-term contract, probably 10, 15, 20 years.
Oh, really? Right, okay.
Over which the service provider can then recoup the costs of those of that heating system. And you get a sort of net cost saving versus a gas boiler, because it's those sorts of time frames that you end up needing to have the
boiler replaced and stuff. Yeah. I'm thinking that it feels like the most similar thing that exists already at scale, I suppose, is people being connected to heat networks. Is it? That's
Yeah.
kind of a similar kind of thing. Although I
He,
suppose in that situation, the kit inside your house is still yours, right? So you're still responsible for the heat interface unit, are you, in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good point, and I think just taking a step back, servitization isn't new, and has
Ooh,
actually been
servitization. What does that mean? That's a new one on me.
servitization. So that's changing your business model rather than selling kind of commodities or products to selling a service. And
Yeah.
servitization has been super successful in loads and loads of sectors.
Oh,
We
right.
experience services all the time. I mean, Netflix is a perfect example, Spotify, your gym subscription, all of those things
My
are
gym
examples
subscription.
of maybe being generous, Jacob, yeah.
Yeah, I think you are.
But actually, I think home energy has probably been a bit behind the curve in terms of the potential for servitization. But yes, heat as a service for district heating is the most common type of heat as a service globally, and it is very established. And that's where you're paying for kilowatt hours of heat out rather than paying for kilowatt hours of electricity in. Plus, you'll have a little bit of extra on top of your monthly payment for the either repayment of your heat interface unit or for the kind of maintenance wrapper of that service.
And there are loads of those, aren't there? There's Milton Keynes, there's Leeds pipes, there's loads of those.
Yeah, and if you
I mean,
look
not
in Europe,
loads, but there's a good amount of them already in the UK and loads in Europe.
yeah, I mean, in the UK, they're not anywhere near as prolific as they are in some European countries, but it's models that work. And I think, that's probably a good point to talk about the kind of two key versions of heat as a service that we see having quite a lot of potential, which is the outcome based heat as a service, which is where you pay a monthly fee for guaranteed internal comfort, and that's however you might define comfort. It might be a set point within a given rooms for a certain number of hours. It could be a given number of warm hours per month, or any other way that you might define it.
Yeah, and a foot rub every Tuesday, that'd be lovely. That'd be great. I like this.
Or there's output based, which is probably more akin to the traditional heat network heat as a service, which is where you would pay for kilowatt hours of heat out of the system rather than kilowatt hours of electricity or gas in. And where that provides a benefit is that if your service provider is responsible for installing and maintaining your system, and you're paying for the a fixed price for the kilowatt hours of heat out, it's in their interests to keep the heating system running as efficiently as possible.
Super efficient,
and ensure that it's designed as efficiently as possible in the first place.
And that's a challenge, right? I've got a heat pump in my house, which I had installed probably 2 or 3 years ago now, 3 years ago maybe, and it's not been without its teething troubles, to be perfectly honest. And I mean, I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I kind of left them to the installation and everything. And you've not really got a lot of control over the quality of that installation, have you? You know,
No.
and as it turned out, the guys who installed it were subcontractors to the company, and they got a few things wrong, which have kind of been ironed out now. But I
think that hits on a real potential for heat as a service as well, because at the moment, you're right, you go out and you commission someone to come and design and install a heat pump system. Once they've got your money, there's very little obligation or responsibility that they have to come back. Yeah, major issues they'll come back and sort, but ensuring that it's running as efficiently as possible, that you're really up to speed and well educated on how you can fine tune it. But when you've got a service contract, there's an ongoing obligation to maintain that system. Also, there's an incentive for the service provider to ensure that it's operating efficiently. And I think looking more broadly at the supply chain capacity issues we're going to have when we're trying to deploy 600,000 heat pumps a year or whatever it is by the mid-2030s, if you've got service providers that have an incentive to establish a high quality, high capacity supply chain, then we could see this helping to support the scale up of heat pump rollout that needs to happen in terms of supply chain capacity, not just actually the number that are being deployed.
So why is it then that we've had heat networks for a while, which is kind of effectively a heat as a service model? Why is now the right time to really step it up and scale it up?
I don't know if there's ever a right time. I think I'm hoping that it feels like there's momentum building at the moment, though, where what we're probably going to need to catalyze this market is some sort of public investment, definitely some regulatory and policy evolution. But it looks like both of those are on the cards at the moment. So we've got the Warm Homes Fund call for evidence that's come out. The first time that energy and heat as a service have been referenced directly, there's about 4 or 5 questions within that call for evidence around the potential for these energy as a service propositions. And from a policy and regulatory point of view, at the moment, from an energy regulator point of view, the problem is that there are, I think it's something like 10,000 pages of energy regulation if you want to be a registered
just the 10,000, right? Yeah,
yeah.
Good.
If you want to be a regulated energy supplier, you have to be able to navigate that huge regulatory landscape. But there are lots of innovative, novel service providers that are trying to bring forward these propositions. And at the moment, they're having to effectively find workarounds or loopholes to be able to provide this energy service without triggering the requirement to become a regulated or a licensed energy supplier.
Yeah.
So I think looking at evolving regulation to be more commensurate to the scale at which you're operating. So the larger you get, the more customers you get, the greater the extent of your service or your supply, the greater the proportion of the overall regulation you need to respond to.
Right.
And I think more generally, it's the regulation just isn't very hospitable to novel service propositions. So as an example, at the moment, when you're paying your electricity or your gas bill, there's a number of different taxes and levies that are included on those bills, and all of those are based on the volume of consumption. So for every kilowatt hour of electricity you consume, part of the price is the actual price of the energy, and then there's a few pence per kilowatt hour that are for different taxes and levies. Problem is if you shift that model where you're not charging volumetrically anymore and actually you're paying a fixed price for a comfortable internal environment, you're paying for an outcome. The problem is there that you can't reasonably charge the taxes and levies that are currently included in your bills, and it's how do you recoup those in a fair way. So it's those sorts of challenges that we need to overcome. They're not insurmountable, but they are clear and present.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's a huge opportunity though, isn't it? Because I mean, let's just assume that we can get the regulation and in the policy landscape right for it. Given the house building targets and stuff that we've got, it feels like there's a massive opportunity to kind of be heating all of those homes in a new, innovative, low carbon, much lower risk for the consumer way.
Yeah. Well, this is already sort of happening. Well, it is already happening with new build. I think if you see the Octopus Zero Bills model, which was probably the first example of that.
I had Nigel Banks on a little while ago talking about that. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a great example. And obviously the opportunities, it's much easier to do this for new build. They're more energy efficient homes. They're designed with these heating systems in mind. You've not got any people in the homes that are worrying about the disruption or pushing back. It's happening at kind of an institutional house builder level. And it's resulting in really clear positive outcomes for the people that buy those homes. Whilst it's more difficult to do in existing homes, doesn't mean that there isn't huge potential. But yeah, it's encouraging to see that these models are working and the supply chains for these energy suppliers to provide these services are there.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that old stat that's kicked around. I don't know. It's probably changed now, the percentages, but 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist, or whatever it is. So clearly, to make this work at scale, we've got to kind of tackle retrofit. And I guess the margins are a bit finer when it comes to retrofit for the supplier of this heat as a service, are they? Because the cost is greater to install it to start with. The homes are less efficient. What does that look like?
I mean, that's the thing, and that, to be honest, is the reason why this hasn't happened at scale yet. Is that the business models are incredibly sensitive to huge number of different variables.
Yeah,
both sort of internal to the service provided and also external factors like energy price volatility. So the fact is that you can make models that work if the variables that influence them are consistent and change in terms of the predictions that you
but they're called variables, right? So
and that volatility makes them risky, particularly over the kind of 10-15 year time horizons. So, and the problem is also that you've got two elements to it. You've got the financing of the asset, the heat pump, and other technology, low carbon technologies that are installed. I mean, that's a very clear, stable, investable model that is already being done. Like heat pump financing and leasing is already being done. You're then combining that with providing a service that wraps in some models, the supply of energy, and that has been an incredibly volatile sector over the last 5 or more years. And so it's trying to square that circle of how do you get those two things to work together that makes the models still investable even though they're inherently volatile. What I would flag though is I think it's easy to see these as comparing them to just installing a heat pump and paying all the upfront capex. Like what's the benefit to the service provider here? They're assuming all of the long-term risk, and they're ultimately still just providing the same commodity output. There are specific revenue streams that you can start to layer on within these heat services that are potentially able to unlock.
So not just a monthly payment from the consumer. There's other stuff.
Well, yeah. So behind the scenes, if you've got these outcome-based models where your service provider is taking responsibility for delivering the heat outcomes that you want, they've got control of your heating system. If you've got solar PV or battery installed as well, they're taking control of all of that. They're delivering you the outcome that you want for a lower price than you would be paying for that if you were managing it yourself. And by taking control of the heating system and other technologies, they can flex the demand in response to variable electricity tariffs. Yes, you can do that yourself, but it requires you to actively engage in that. Also, they've got economies of scale. They can hedge their energy procurement. They can probably flex in a way that has greater sight and leverages greater returns. But I think the exciting thing that puts the fully sort of managed heat as a service above and beyond is the fact that you can aggregate the flexibility potential from these heat pumps, the flexibility available from the battery and the PV to aggregate and sell on the flexibility markets, which is actually a market that domestic heat has historically not really engaged with. It's happening at an industrial level, it's happening in commercial buildings, but domestic heat hasn't really tried to access these flexibility markets.
Partly because I suppose it traditionally it's not generated by electricity, is it? It's generated by gas, and it's much more difficult then.
But also, people don't want to relinquish control of their heating system, for electric heating.
Who wants to bother with that? Scrubbing around in the airing cupboard, or rooting around on your phone to think, oh, I can make a couple of pence here.
Yeah, or if you do give control of your heating system to a service provider, people want control, people want autonomy, and that's why it doesn't work if you're just giving up control without getting something guaranteed in return. But these heat services, you have a service quality that you expect, and if you don't get that, you're just going to leave. But yeah, talking about domestic heat not really accessing these flexibility markets, I think storage heaters are a really good example of like historic energy electrical heating that has probably been a bit ahead of the curve in terms of accessing these flexibility markets.
Ahead of the curve in terms of using cheap rate electricity and stuff, but definitely not ahead of the curve in terms of quality outcomes for the consumer, I would suggest.
But having said that, we've been working with an innovator at the Catapult called Connected Response, who have smart storage heaters, and they've been installing them in social housing, and they've been aggregating and controlling the demand from those storage heaters to ensure that the tenant gets a comfortable environment, no change in their thermal comfort, but they are providing a return for giving access to the flexibility from these systems, so flexing the demand from these systems. And that is meaningfully reducing tenants' bills. So tenants are still getting exactly the same heat outcomes, but they're getting lower bills. And in a social housing context where people are much more at risk of fuel poverty, that's a real positive outcome. So yeah, that's I think a nice focused snapshot of what this could look like at a bigger scale.
Yeah, and the other thing for me, I don't live in a city. I've always kind of lived out in the sticks a little bit, and I'm thinking about off-grid people, off of gas grid, consumers, and their only option historically for heating really was probably oil. Really, loads of places around here have got oil, and this gives them a kind of an alternative which is much more flexible. That feels like a real option now for them potentially.
And I think one thing I didn't mention earlier is that we work in this sector. I think we've got an idea about what kilowatt hour is. We know how energy systems work. But the vast majority of the population don't have that understanding.
And they shouldn't need it really.
They shouldn't need to have it. No, and we can't rely on them having that understanding if we're going to see the transition at pace that we need. And so understanding what a kilowatt hour is, first of all, a lot of people don't understand. It's not tangible, but people do understand if they're warm. They do understand if they're comfortable.
Yep.
Another thing that we've seen and is a little bit of a barrier here is people already think they're paying a fixed price for their heating because their monthly direct debit is a fixed amount. They don't understand that below that the energy provider is charging for the kilowatt hours that they're consuming, and adjusting their direct debit on maybe an annual basis to make sure that they've got enough there. So it's this consumer understanding and trust that is one of the bigger barriers to overcome. But if we're providing high quality heat services where all of the complexity and the risk is taken off the consumer, put onto the service provider, and the consumer still gets the same or a better outcome in terms of their comfort, this potentially can massively improve consumer trust. And it's I think the potential's great.
It is. I mean, it feels like a real win-win. What I'm wondering though is, well, there's loads of things. I've been kind of making some notes as we've been chatting. I'm thinking, right, there's loads in this. Just to get into the technical side, just for a minute.
You don't need to encourage me to get into the technical side.
Well, that's what I'm telling you. We're just going to talk about it for a minute. I'm thinking to myself that, that idea of being able to tap into the flexibility market and stuff. If you were a provider of heat as a service and you had a big portfolio of stuff, one of the things I read in one of the briefing documents you put together was the fact that you might just create new peaks rather than kind of smoothing peaks. You might just create new peaks. But if you're providing, you had a kind of diverse portfolio, some older homes that respond a bit less quickly maybe, or some modern homes that have got a faster response rate, but all of that kind of depends on having really good data, doesn't it, and kind of understanding how the different bits of your portfolio are going to respond, so that you can kind of play tunes on it. Presumably they're going to have algorithms doing all this stuff, right? But data is going to be key to this, isn't it? So not just one bit of data coming from your smart meter. They're going to want more than that, right? Presumably.
Well, yes. I mean, so there's a few things in there to unpack, but I think digital interoperability is something we talk about a lot at the Catapult, and it's about how, if we're going to have this smart, dynamic, responsive home, all of the disparate bits of energy infrastructure need to be able to talk to one another and talk to the wider grid and system. And at the moment, that doesn't happen. We've got lots of fragmented ecosystems, or we've got a very fragmented ecosystem of different APIs and programs that don't work well together, but there is progress in trying to establish the standards for that interoperability. So that should be overcome in the near future. The conversation about herding, which is what we call it when all of the demand is shifted from one peak to another because of these these very sharp variable electricity prices. I mean, the Octopus Go tariff's a perfect example. It drops down to 7 pence a kilowatt hour at midnight, and everybody starts charging their car.
That's right, charge my car.
Exactly. And you've got, a typical home might have a 2 or 3 kilowatt peak demand, generally diversified peak demand. If you start putting in a 7 kilowatt car charger, it massively increases the demand that the grid is seeing. So you're right. At the moment, when you've got lots of individual heat pumps all wanting to turn on when the price is the cheapest, that is going to cause an increased peak. But if you see a service provider taking control of, a portfolio of 10,000, particularly if they've got a lot within a specific area, they can meaningfully manage the demand in a way that can respond to grid signals at a much larger scale and ensure that the grid remains stable, which is going to be a massive challenge as we electrify heat and transport.
What I'm thinking about is, of those 10,000 homes, they're going to want to understand, if I switch the heating on now, how long is it before I'm delivering those outcomes that people want, and that will vary across that portfolio, right? Because some houses will respond differently to others, and they're going to need to the algorithm will need to understand that to be able to kind of think about when each of those homes comes on, goes off, whatever.
Yeah, well, so I think that comes on to that points to another thing as well, which is about the integration of the other information within the home that would be needed to be able to deliver this really effectively. This is what I'm
thinking about. Yeah.
So if you've got, the Tado TRVs on your radiators, which are kind of room level temperature sensors, whatever means you might have of
so TRVs, by the way, those are kind of adjustable.
Yeah, the thermostatic radiator valves, the ones that you twist them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it doesn't need to be those. Whatever means that the service provider has of seeing the temperature in the rooms that you want to heat in your house, and they will be able to get the data from when they turn your heat pump on to when your room gets up to temperature.
Exactly.
Given the
Yeah.
external weather at that time, they'll have a very, very good idea about how much heat loss there is through your home, how long it takes to heat up in different times.
Yeah.
And for that, it's through that sort of data and insight that they can then know how much they need to preheat the home. If there's a cheap window of power before you get up in the morning, it might decide it's going to preheat your home for a couple of hours. It might use more energy to do that, but it will be cheaper because it's using much cheaper electricity. And yeah, when you start to gather that data at a portfolio level, it becomes super, super powerful. And the data point is one where this sort of service will massively increase the volume of data that we have on heat pump operation. And that can be meaningfully fed back into service design and management to improve the service for everyone. Like any sector where you get constant stream of high quality data coming in that you can use to refine and improves the situation for everyone. At the moment, there's very little availability to that sort of data that allows that kind of proposition design and refinement. And it's one of the challenges that we're seeing for those service providers that are designing propositions at the moment. They just don't have the insight that they need to be able to de-risk and properly design these services. And that's actually where our living lab at the Catapult comes in. We've got 5,500 homes, people around the real world homes around the UK, variety of different typologies, tenures, heating technologies, locations that people have very kindly volunteered to provide their smart meter data and other information about their home. And we use them to run trials of different energy services and products with innovators that we work with. And so, that facility is there if there are any service providers listening that might want to come and work with us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was thinking about that. I was thinking how it's that chicken and egg thing, isn't it? They kind of need the data to provide the service, but they need to be providing the service to get the data. And it's kind of, how do they overcome that hurdle? And maybe that's one way of doing it, I suppose. Something that I'm very interested in, though, is you mentioned interoperability. And if I was a skeptic about this, I might say it sounds like just a way of big companies tying people into long contracts for fixed amount of money. If they kind of effectively own the kit, because that's one of the things that would be different, right? Because right now, if I decide I don't want to be with Optimus anymore, I can tomorrow switch to somebody else. But with this, that feels a bit more tricky, particularly if the interoperability isn't there. So what's the kind of situation with that?
Yeah, really good question. And there's a few things to unpick there as well. So the ownership model is a point of discussion at the moment. If you are installing something in someone's home as a service provider that they are paying back over a long period, there's always the risk that they're going to default on those payments. And it's politically and ethically unacceptable to go into someone's home and rip their heating system out. Notwithstanding the fact that if you go in and rip someone's heat pump out of their home, no one else is going to want to pay for that heat pump. So you're not recouping any of the asset value that you've lost. Yep. And I won't profess to know about the kind of minutiae of these different third-party ownership models, consumer hire purchase. But Citizens Advice, we've been doing a bit of work with them.
Oh, right. Okay.
We've been engaging with them as part of, there's a group called the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition that was formerly chaired by Mark McDonald, involving a few interested stakeholders, I'd call them, around the heat as a service world. That's now transitioned to be chaired by LSBU, London South Bank University. And
great university, by the way.
Yeah, shout out to South Bank. But that community of practice is really bringing sort of people together to think about what are the barriers that we need to overcome to get this market moving. And we, through that, engaged with Citizens Advice. We've got a fantastic report out on third-party ownership models for home energy. And that's very much looking at how do we protect consumers, but also enable these ownership models to work for home energy. The long-term contracts is an interesting one as well. Typically, I think it's about 6 or 7 years people stay in their homes. And at the moment, in order to make
is it 6 or 7? Is that right?
I think that's the average. I think that's the average amount of time. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm an outlier, potentially in the markets that heat as a service might first be targeted at, like the only owner-occupier market. Yeah. Maybe the longer term, people stay in their homes for a longer period there. But on the whole, this is going to be an issue that these models come up against, because to make them stack up from a sort of viability point of view, you're talking 10, 15 years plus. And that's where it's a shame that Johnny's not on the call from the Green Finance Institute, because they've got a model called property linked finance, which rather than the debt being tied to you as an individual, it's tied to your home. And I won't profess to know the details of how that works, but it is a really clear way of allowing these service contracts to transfer ownership with the property.
Yes, I see. Okay. Yes, we should just give Johnny a quick shout out. So Johnny from the Green Finance Institute was going to join us today, but unfortunately he's not been able to. So hope everything's working out okay, Johnny, and we'll catch up at some point in the future, no doubt. Yeah, so that's a complicated picture, isn't it? And just onto another another challenge, I suppose, because I'm thinking, in principle, it sounds brilliant. It sounds like a great way of de-risking, what is probably a significant, not a worry for homeowners, but it's one of the big things that can go wrong, right? Your boiler goes wrong, or or something else happens with your heating system, and it's an absolute pain when it does. So it gets rid of that from the homeowner, and that's cool. And I was thinking about the other barriers to this, and the one that I think is a challenge is what I was saying about my heat pump. So the installers didn't really know what they were doing. Is to be frank. I ought to say, by the way, the company that employed them has been brilliant since, has been helping me out no end, which is great. But skills presumably is, as ever, with kind of a new way of doing things, and the fact that this depends on quality installations to work. Is skills a thing? Are we seeing are we upskilling at enough pace to kind of support this new industry?
Not. And that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier, is that if service providers are taking responsibility for these systems, not just when they're installed, but on an ongoing basis, it's in their interest, if they're going to minimize the cost to serve and the engineer call outs and all of these things that service design thinks about in order to de-risk and minimize cost to serve, it is very much in their interests to create a supply chain that can deliver quality installations. And I don't know what that would look like, but I think it's something that there isn't the same incentive for it to happen through the kind of traditional heat pump installation route, where installers are very separate to the ones that end up providing your energy in the future. And even then, it's sort of a perverse incentive for those energy suppliers that are installing you heat pumps, because if they install you a badly performing heat pump that uses more energy, they make more money off you for the energy that you consume. I'm not saying that is the incentive for energy suppliers, but they're not installing bad systems because of it. But it does create perverse incentives there, where actually when you start talking about a service proposition, you align those incentives, and that's where there's a clear distinction, I think.
Yeah, it feels like it's such a, well, it's not, not necessarily an obvious move, but as soon as you think about it, you think this is a great proposition. This has to be able to work. And I'm just thinking, who are going to be those big consumers of this? And the things that immediately come to mind are people like housing developers, landlords, housing associations, maybe, working in association with local authorities and things like that. Are those where we're going to see big uptake? Any interest from those guys at the moment?
Yeah, and so I think one of the benefits of heat as a service as a concept is that traditional energy supply, it's a very homogenous market. Everyone's selling the same kind of commodity fuel. They're very tight margins. It's very difficult to differentiate. There's also no diversity in the market, which diversity is always good for consumers. By which you mean? Well, so with heat as a service, you can tailor propositions to suit very specific consumer segments, housing archetypes, heat technologies, or general low carbon technologies. So you can design these propositions not to fit everyone, but to fit very specific markets and tenures. And so social housing is a really good example of where you can create specific models that work within that context. And we've been working with an innovator called Zero, who they go in, they install a heat pump, potentially some PV and some battery if they think that that's going to be beneficial for the specific home in question. And they then recoup the cost of that through a monthly comfort charge. But that comfort charge is much less than the reduction in bills that the tenant sees. And so the tenants are paying back the cost of that equipment month on month, but they are seeing meaningfully reduced bills through it. Yeah. And the social housing provider is responding to their net zero commitments, decarbonising their portfolio, actually ensuring better, more importantly, better comfort for those tenants that are in their homes. So like there are models there which work really well. And for service providers, social housing is a good example because there is the default risk can be assumed by the social housing provider rather than the tenant. So I think that's where we see the immediate opportunity for this within certain sectors, social housing being one of them.
Yeah. I was going to say that makes so much sense, does it? In that social housing market, one of the things that I've always thought was just desperately, but just kind of madness, really, is the fact that so many folks living in social housing are on prepaid meters and they're paying the most for their energy per unit, and it's like, how is that a fair system? But this is a kind of way of, because heat is one of the biggest, because quite often, I don't know why it is, but quite often when I used to be on the tools, we go to social housing things and do repairs and stuff, and loads of them had electric heating. Are cheaper to install in the first place, maybe, I don't know.
Exactly,
so it's really expensive for them to heat. Really
expensive.
The underlying technology is more expensive to heat your home anyway, and you're paying more because you're using a prepaid meter. So this is a great way of trying to tackle some of that.
Yeah. It is. I mean, the challenge is some of these models are incompatible with those on prepayment meters just because of the way that it's charged. But that doesn't mean that we can't, that there aren't ways to overcome that. And one of the other challenges, and more generally for those that are in a position where they have to really ration the heat that they take, is that heat pumps often operate much better low and slow. But if someone that's very used to being quite reactive and intermittent with the way that they heat, in order to reduce bills, they are more likely to try and overcome the low and slow running of the heat pump. That means that it will be operating optimally. So where these, again, service models can be good is that if the service provider is taking responsibility for the operation of that heat pump, and the tenant knows that they're getting the outcome that they want for a certain price. But I think that there are barriers to overcome more generally with heat pump rollout, particularly in these low income and vulnerable groups where it might be quite counterintuitive for the heat pumps to be operating in the way that they do most optimally for that particular, of those particular groups.
And I can imagine those people would be worried about, hang on, why is this running all the time? This is going to cost me money, but it's not, because that's the model. But you touched on something else there, which I'd also thought about. You said right early on that the provider is going to be controlling your heating effectively because they are controlling it to deliver you the outcome that you've agreed on, and that might not feel comfortable for some people to say, actually, but sometimes I want it a bit warmer, or sometimes I'm feeling hot and I want to turn it on. How much control do I retain over my environment?
The first thing I'll say is that there's going to be no model where you as a homeowner or as an occupant can't immediately take control of your heating system. That's just not going to wash with anyone. So there's always going to be the opportunity for you to do that. What service providers need to do is design and deliver services that are so good no one ever wants to do that. And again, that's where it puts the incentive on them to create very, very high quality outcomes. Where you're talking about the kind of slight tweaks to the experience that you're receiving, that's again where there'll be a way that you can request a slightly warmer internal temperature, or a tweak to the service or the outcomes, that the service provider will get the data for that. They'll understand, they'll know, and they'll be then able to refine the service that's delivered to you. So that kind of slight nudging and tweaking, I imagine the first kind of, as you would with a normal heat pump installation, the first 3 months you're going to be tweaking constantly to make sure that it's giving you the outcomes that you want. But your service provider is going to learn that. They're also going to have all of the data from the thousands of other homes that are quite similar to you and have similar desires to you, and so they're very likely to be able to give you a better initial service because they've got all of this other data to lean on that allows them to inform how to deliver you the service that you want. So it's data is always going to make this better in theory. I think I'm quite optimistic and ideological about this. I will caveat that, but I like to think I'm rooted in the realism of what could be possible.
Have we got any, beyond kind of heat networks which already exist, have we got much in the way of pilot activity going on with heat as a service, with heat pumps and stuff like that? Are there any pilots going on, and how are people reacting to it?
So there isn't.
Not liking it?
as far as I understand, there isn't any that have done the kind of fully packaged, fully managed heat as a service. This
Yeah.
outcomes based, you're paying a fixed price for your monthly heat, and all of the management of that is done by your provider. We've done outcomes based heat as a service trials within our living lab back in the
Yep.
day, but those were with gas boilers, and understanding
Oh,
are
okay.
people willing to pay a fixed price for their for the heat from
And
their gas
that's the
boiler.
key thing, right? It feels to me like the medium is kind of less of an issue, really. That you know, whether it's gas boiler or heat pump or heat network, it's less for me as a consumer. The thing I would be interested in is, am I comfortable paying this fixed monthly fee? Am I comfortable giving up an amount of control in my home? Those are the things that I think
Yeah.
would be.
Well, so I think on the medium, first of all, I think where this has significant benefits for heat pump rollout because it removes risk, it reduces complexity, and
Totally.
for unfamiliar heating systems, it can be the security that consumers need to commit, all of that sort of thing. What it does for gas boilers, there's not the same kind of benefits, and we risk a little bit of kind of carbon lock-in. But what
I mean,
it could be,
forget gas boilers. I'm just saying that it as a consumer, whether
oh,
I have a
what you
gas
see,
boiler,
it doesn't matter whether you've
yeah,
got a heat
that's what I
pump or
mean.
a gas boiler. The service design would be a little bit different, but ultimately, what
Of course.
the change in your experience would be quite similar.
Yeah.
And we're so talking back to pilots. I think we're still a way off having. So we've individually tested the different components of this fully packaged, fully managed, outcome-based heat as a service, but we haven't tested them all together yet. But I don't think
Right.
that's where the market's going to go immediately. To be honest, it's going to
Okay.
be a gradual kind of movement from traditional domestic heat delivery along that spectrum of options that I said. And what we are seeing already happening is people getting a heat pump and solar PV and battery installed and paying a fixed monthly price for the repayment of that, with the kind of system optimization and maintenance wrapped into that, and some of the management starting to be designed by whoever's installing that kit, but it's not as far as that fully managed service that we've been talking about a lot today.
And you may not know the answer to this, but the zero bill stuff from Octopus, and I think there's other similar sorts of things, aren't there? Is that's not heat as a service though, is it? Or is it?
Well, it's not called heat as a service. It's not been branded as heat as a service.
No.
And to be honest, I think the market probably needs a better terminology for it, because heat as a service is not particularly emotive,
Not that catchy, is it?
enticing.
Yeah.
No.
But zero bills is
Zero
feels like
bills
a very
is.
attractive title, right?
And I think something with a similar sort of kind of marketing pizzazz is needed for this. But zero bills is a type of heat as a service, really, that you're given all of the heat. I think the difference is it's being installed in a new build property. The model itself is similar to, I think, what the experience would be for someone on one of these managed heat services, because it's effectively having the technology installed for you. The responsibility for maintaining it is not yours, and the operation of it to minimize your bills is also given to a third party. And it's that arrangement where all you're worrying about is whether you're warm and comfortable, and what the number at the bottom of your bill is at the end of the month.
I mean, it feels like, from a consumer point of view, there's why wouldn't I suppose the main, maybe I'm just thinking this through, and I'm thinking, actually, you know what, maybe I wouldn't care how the heat was provided, as long as I've got, like you say, as long as I'm warm and comfortable and I understand what my monthly payment is going to be. Okay, here's a question now, actually. Here's a question which I think maybe one of your briefing notes starts to talk about, is there's quite a lot of volatility in the energy market, for me to buy my energy from whoever, unless I'm on a fixed tariff or something like that. And if you're locked into somebody for 10 or 15 years, I wonder how fixed is that price, the monthly price you're paying? What happens if if there's another, like there is at the moment, with things that are going on in the Middle East?
So my knowledge of business model design is fairly high level, and that's probably being generous.
That sounds perfect. Let's go with that.
What I would say is that I think it's going to be, if someone manages to make this kind of fixed price model work, I think that will be very exciting. But to be able to de-risk providing fixed price. And yes, you could incorporate something like a kind of index increase year on year that reflects the price of, and maybe then if you're procuring energy or you're committing to a price of energy over the course of a year and it indexes each year, like you could make something work with that. I think where we're more likely to see, or what we're more likely to see happen, is that you will still be paying a pence per kilowatt hour price for heat, but the service provider will guarantee that price is lower than you would be paying, even if for the equivalent from a gas boiler or from a heat pump that you'd installed yourself. So by maintaining and managing your system really effectively, doing whatever they can in terms of hedging and energy procurement, varying demand, and then accessing these additional revenue streams like the flexibility markets, they should in theory be able to reduce the cost per kilowatt hour of heat below what you would be paying if you were just paying your retail energy supply for the electricity.
And not only that, you'd have to figure, as a consumer, you'd have to figure it, if you're doing it yourself, you'd have to figure in, the repayment cost of putting in your heat pump and, upsizing all your radiators and all that kind of, which is not cheap. So, they've got a bit of headroom to play with there, haven't they? The installer, I suppose.
You've just hit on something really interesting there, which I think is a broader point, but it really relates to this kind of heat as a service. Is at the moment people don't replace their heating systems typically until they break. The market isn't in a position to do reactive or distressed heat pump installs. Generally, people, when their boiler breaks, they don't want to be going without a shower or hot water and heating.
And it's very quick to get a new boiler right and just whack it in.
Exactly. So I think there's technological progress happening within the heat pump sector that could allow this to happen.
High temperature heat pumps, for example.
High temperature heat pumps, yes, but I think more importantly is the fully packaged external modular units. So rather than having to have space internally for your cylinder and your internal evaporator, condenser, and all of the other stuff that normally goes inside, typically you've just got your evaporator outside, haven't you? So the condenser outside. God, you're testing my.
Like I said, I'm not a mechanical engineer, but whatever you say. Condenser, evaporator.
Yeah, well, whatever your external unit is, I've got a heat pump at home, and I've got a fridge freezer sized unit internally, which is my hot water cylinder and my internal bit of the heat pump. What there are some quite exciting innovators doing is looking at how you can package a heat pump into a modular external unit that just gets craned into place outside where your normal external unit would be. Yes, they're a little bit bigger than your typical external unit, but most people, if you're already installing a kind of big grey box outside, it doesn't matter if it's a little bit bigger, you then end up only needing to drill 4 holes through the wall. And because they're high temperature, you can connect to all your existing radiators.
I think that's the absolute kicker, that is.
And if you can start to provide heat as a service with those reactive installs, I think that as a proposition could be super exciting. And it might be that you don't even need to think about these more ambitious end of the kind of outcome based, but just being able to provide the security of a heat service with the unfamiliar heating system could be the way that we get people to really buy into this. The other thing I'll just quickly say is that that's really only going to work though if we see a significant reduction in the spark gap, so the price difference between electricity and gas. Because at the moment, if you're replacing a gas boiler with a heat pump without doing any kind of reinforcement of the fabric of the building, you're going to see probably a moderate energy price or a energy bill increase when you're doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much in this, isn't there? One of the things that happened when we had our heat pump installed was the disruption was really significant.
Yeah.
I mean, as it happened, I wanted some alterations to the pipework, but people coming in, all the radiators having to be replaced, some of the pipe having to be replaced, ripping all the airing cupboard apart, putting the new internal unit in. The external unit was fine, but that idea of being able to do it reactively, that'd be a game changer, wouldn't it? And the other thing, I know what I was going to say actually. The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is super exciting about this, is that it's potentially a really powerful way to overcome the barrier of unfamiliarity with people. We want people to be on heat pumps domestically, pretty much. That's probably maybe not in every situation, but I think most. And one of the big barriers to that is upfront cost and unfamiliarity. It feels like to me, and those two things can be almost not entirely swept away, but very much reduced through the use of heat as a service.
Exactly, yeah. And that trust that someone else is responsible if something goes wrong. You're willing to take the plunge for an unfamiliar technology because any of the consequences of, or the perceived risks of that unfamiliar technology are assuaged by the fact that your service provider has to deal with them if they happen.
So tell me then, it sounds like we're just at the start of this taking off, and I really hope it does. It's a brilliant concept, I think. If it was really successful, if it really worked, what would it look like in 2036, in 10 years' time?
I think that it would be unremarkable. I think it would be as familiar as...
You wouldn't even notice.
Yeah, well, it would be as familiar as having your mobile phone contract. Like, how many people pay upfront for their mobile phone anymore? People pay per month for their handset and the minutes and data that goes with it. And I think that as a model for heat delivery or heat supply will be just commonplace. And it's not going to be right for everyone. It might not even be right for most people, but it will be right for some, and a significant enough proportion of the population of the UK that it's meaningfully helped catalyze, because it's not just going to have an impact within those that are on heat service contracts. If you're building high quality, high capacity supply chains for heat pump deployment, that's going to benefit the whole deployment, the whole market. Yeah. So I think anything that increases diversity of consumer offer, aligns incentives, moves risk from consumers to third parties is going to be attractive and beneficial for consumers. It's also hopefully going to be beneficial for service providers. If they can make these profitable business models stack up, they're going to be able to make money. And it's also going to be great for the grid because it's more predictable, controllable demand, which is going to reduce the reinforcement costs that we need if we're going to fully decarbonize the electricity system. And it's generally going to help accelerate our transition to net zero. So again, I've already said I'm quite an optimist. I'm quite utopian about this, but I do think that it can work. I think the biggest barrier that we've got is the risk of bringing forward propositions in the current market. And that, I think, without a catalyst from government, I think we're going to struggle. But that's why it was so exciting to be at a workshop hosted by the Green Finance Institute and attended by DESNZ last week on specifically the heat and energy as a service questions within the Warm Homes Fund call for evidence.
Okay.
Exploring how, and again, this is where I wish Johnny was here because his knowledge of how financial transactions within the government work. But as I understand it, there is the opportunity to provide catalytic funding from the public sector to the private sector where it is able to deliver an outcome that the private sector or the private market cannot deliver on its own. It's always with the intention of providing a return on investment for the Treasury. This isn't grant funding. This is investment into a market that should return. But what it allows the market to do is it moves some of the risk for this not working from the service provider and the private sector to the public sector. And so one way that could work is through something like blended finance, where you might have a kind of 80-20 arrangement, allows institutional investment in these companies where at a rate that or at a cost that is comparable and makes these viable these business models stack up as viable. Because at the moment, borrowing money on these very risky propositions is just too expensive to be able to make them stack up. Another way is I've seen I think it's Oxford City Council. There was someone from SMS who was delivering this in partnership with Oxford City Council in the room. And they're doing a great model with a combination of social housing and owner occupier, where they're taking the default risk effectively from the service provider providing this heat pump installation and other low carbon technologies. They're being repaid on a monthly basis. They're seeing lower bills, but the local authority is taking the default risk for that debt. And I think that's another really interesting way that you can kind of localize this, because local authorities have a responsibility to support decarbonisation in their jurisdiction. You've also got networks that are obviously very locally focused and locally constrained. So if you can start to, again, align these incentives between the local authority, the local networks and the people within that community, I think that's a really exciting way that public money could help to catalyse this as well.
I tell you what, the more you talk about it, Tom, the more excited I get. It sounds like an absolutely fantastic proposition. So look, if somebody wanted to find out more about it, how could they do that? Where would they go?
I would be very happy to have a conversation. My name's Tom Wigg. You can find me on LinkedIn, or I'm sure Kev will drop my email address into the description of the podcast.
Sure, absolutely, you can do that. Great. And can they find out information from the Catapult?
Yeah,
so stuff they can read.
We've got, I must admit, most of the stuff that we've got online at the moment is from trials and information that's a little bit aged now, might I say. But there is plans for us to release lots of work that I've been doing behind the scenes. There's a suite of 7 briefing documents that cover what Heat as a Service is generally as an introduction, and then a number of different documents tailored towards different stakeholder groups, things like service providers, consumers and landlords, investors and insurers, energy suppliers. So once those are up and running on the website, I would encourage everyone to go and have a look at those, because they're supposed to be quite a nice, accessible introduction, quite concise, not reams and reams.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you. It is a pleasure as always to chat to you about such an exciting topic. Have a great
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, very grateful.
Thanks for coming on. All right, we'll speak again soon. Take care.
Bye.